I'm Jim Collison and live from the Gallup Studios here, Studio B here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Called the Coach, recorded on October 18th, 2018. Called the Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. On this special edition of Called the Coach, we'll spend time in investigating the experience, emotional, and empirical aspects of each element of Gallup's Q12, our engagement instrument, to know how to increase it for our coaching. In today's case, we're actually going to cover the very, very practical Gallup Business Center and the reporting associated with it. So hang tight with us. This may be one where if you're listening to the audio, you might want to jump off and head over to YouTube, search Gallup Strength Center on YouTube, and go to our channel, find the playlist Q12 for Coaches. You might want to watch this one on video because we're going to spend a lot of time doing demonstrative components of the website. If you have questions during the webcast, we do have a chat room. It's available for you right below the main video window, although for some people it's disappearing. But if you see it down there, click on the login button, choose the guest account, take the guest name and number out, put your name in and hit submit. You'll be in there as well. And there's a few of you out there today listening. If you're listening to the recorded version or have questions about anything related to strengths or Q12, you can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. And of course, don't forget to visit the Gallup Strength Center, just gallupstrengthcenter.com. Today, our business center, right? Q12.gallup.com is where you're going to want to go to get this information. Actually, without having an account, there's a lot of information you can still get out there about our Q12. You might want to head out and try it today. We want to thank you for doing that as well. Mike McDonald is our host today. He works as a senior workplace consultant here on the riverfront with me. Mike, welcome to our last Q12 for Coaches, at least for 2018.
Yeah, no, Jim, it's been a great series for me. I appreciate the opportunity, right? Yeah, I was thinking about the parallel when you were talking about it earlier with just how this is one of those subjects, right, where it's just like infinite. And the parallel with strengths, right? Can you ever learn everything about the strengths? No. Can you really ever learn everything about engagement? No. And I think that's part of the invitation that we get to say yes to, is to throw ourselves in and just know that while it's wildly recreational, it's wildly useful, but also the fact that it's never going to be in that done, checked off the box category, right? We can just go forever in the discovery aspect of it, which is part of what I think makes both so exciting and I guess consistent with each other.
Yeah, you're always learning more, always opportunities to do it a little bit different. I think the work landscape is changing on us constantly. And so what worked 5 years ago may not work anymore, or may need to be revised, or you may need to ask different questions. You know, I just think we got to keep our ear to the ground to hear what's going on and stay alert. I get the opportunity to work with these high school and college students. We're going to look at some Q12 scores of college students. Yes, the Q12 will work at the college level, which is pretty awesome. So we'll prove that today. And so they teach me a lot about engagement as I have really ordinary conversations with them about how they approach school and the future of the workplace, and with our interns, how they work here and what motivates them and what are they looking for. Mike, there's a huge fear among this current generation that's in college. They're not going to be able to find jobs. And we have told these students their whole life, if you just go to college, you're going to people are begging you to work. And somehow that's translated to, we're never going to find jobs.
Yeah.
And so there's great anxiety around that.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the value of strengths and engagement, right? Not to get too far into the subject of students, I guess, Jim, for this particular discussion, but for a point of context that you're bringing up, that's the whole point, right? Between strengths and engagement is the fact that it really puts people in control. And I'll speak a little bit cliche, but in control of the destiny of their lives, right? If I know I've got these 5 strengths and I know what engagement looks like, I should be able to arm myself to be more capable and effective as I enter into the workplace. And if I do that well, then maybe I even have choices about which company I'm saying yes to relative to those that I say no to. And I don't have to say yes to the first job offer that comes along, regardless of whether it's really the right spot for me or has the best in mind for me. So yeah, the spectrum there, I think again, going back to what I love about the use of what you're doing with students is that's a primary intersection where it can, very few can change the trajectory of a life. I think in the same way as where you're intersecting those conversations about strengths and engagement into that classroom or academic success path and how it translates into a career, not just a career as a job, a career as a calling. And I think there's a translation there that you're causing to happen, Jim.
Yeah, Mike, before we dig into the business center and some of the reportings, let's remind the individuals, now's the time, by the way, to take advantage of these resources. We've been saying this every single week. If you've been blowing us off like, yeah, I'll get there. Now is the time to go out and get that case of books. You want to get a case of them so you can give them away to your managers and have them start on this process. But Mike, what are the resources that we're going to be paying attention to here, or we've been paying attention to throughout the series?
Yeah, let's put these to work. Let's really put these to work. This is really representative of the conversation today, where we're featuring the mechanics and the systems and the equipment that you actually have to deliver on engagement, right? To deliver on your coaching and your consulting. And so we want to make sure that the resources that we've been discussing throughout, really that we continue to make sense out of them in every aspect. So we are, again, going to be talking and referencing in the Positioning at First Break All the Rules, right? That book that really takes us through the discovery of these 12 elements, the context around them. Unique to the newest edition of the First Break All the Rules book that you want to make sure that you possess is a StrengthsFinder code in the back, as well as a code for Q12, where up to 10 associates can take the Q12. And again, it's a fantastic resource where, as an addition to a coaching and consulting conversation, think about that leader taking StrengthsFinder, coaching them, and it gets the backdrop and the context of their team. Having taken Q12 and having those scores in that same conversation, you can extend a profound leadership coaching experience and move a team into higher orders of performance, really, just with that book and the two codes within it. So think about that, and think about the dashboard and again, the mechanics that we'll be talking about today. The other thing that we'll be talking about and integrating, and encourage you all to do so as well, is really sit down and take a look at the book 12, The Elements of Great Managing. It just arms you with so many stories and a qualitative context to each of the elements that brings the life into engagement, so that they're not items, it's not grand mean scores and metrics, but it's literal living, breathing people who have stories that bring the best of each of these engagement features to life in front of us. So a great book and resource for you to have at your disposal as you become masters of engagement. And then obviously the real-time dynamic and delivery around our reports, right? So we talk a lot about our State of the American Workplace report. So think about the credibility that you have when you have the research that's supported in these reports as something that you can aim and target performance towards. Why are we doing engagement? Because this report says it matters, and here's the validation of that. Why are we doing strengths? It's because this report tells us performance is increased when we do so. So really lean into those resources. And then the second one that we referenced and have really put to work is our re-engineering performance management report. That when you think about the notion of coaching, not just for ourselves as we interact with leaders and workplaces, but the extended coaching of those team leaders as they coach on into their own teams through that same perspective and lens. What do the conversations look like? How often should they happen? What's the content of those conversations? What are the outcomes that they're intended to generate? All of that's really wrapped up and represented in the accountability through that particular report. So I really like the call to action, Jim, about what today represents, because it is the synthesis of all of those coming together and building a robust coaching and consulting arm, a robust coaching consulting extension of the best of who we are and our own abilities to take on into our clients and move their organizations forward.
No, that's great. Good reminder. Today, I'll remind you what we'll be looking at today are the actual implementations for the last 3 years of the work that I have done on college campuses, both the University of Maryland and University of Nebraska at Lincoln, particularly in our Rake School that is there, a separate college, honors college that's there. I spend a lot of time thinking in most of these classes. I've had 2 class periods, so 2 hour and 15-minute class periods to be able to do this, 2.5 hours of in the sessions in the classroom. And the goal was really in these classes, they took both CliftonStrengths and they took the Q12 assessment. They took it at various times throughout the semester. We're kind of monkeying around with a little bit of like, when is the right time for these? We've actually moved this year in Lincoln, we've moved that administration to midterms as opposed to the beginning of the year, to see if that would change our numbers at all on when we introduce a little bit of stress into the environments. When you take it this first week of class or the 8th week of class or whatever midterms are, 6 week, right? Are they 12-week semesters? Maybe a little bit different, right? How they approach things. Strengths don't change, but man, engagement can a lot in between those times, right? And so we have administered them during those sessions. We've also done it in the context of teams and team formations. Oftentimes in these classes, there might be a capstone class, there might be a freshman class that they're going to be put on teams to do projects. When we do strengths and engagement together, we can really accelerate what I call team formations, right? When we're putting teams together, they're understanding who they are and how they're set up and what they need to know about each other. Both these tools used together, I think, can take what in some cases may take an entire semester for the team to understand itself. We can have that done in about 2 weeks. So they can be really, really productive moving forward on whatever work, whatever project they're going to do. I'll also say these have always been technology teams. That's what I do. I recruit out of technology groups. So in often cases, these are your hardcore software developers, project managers, MIS folks, right? These are our technologists for the future. So just as not that should change anything. I just want to give you some idea. The groups I work with are technology and technology related. So that's the context kind of going into this. I'm going to spend some time. This is where I mentioned early on that you may want to come to the video for this because we're going to do a lot of screen sharing. I'm going to put that up. The intent is not for it to be perfect on the screen sharing. There may be some things you can't see. We'll try and blow that up as big as we can. But in some cases, just to give you an idea, right? If you go buy the book, First Break All the Rules right now, you get that CliftonStrengths code, but you get 10 seats on this. And you can try this out yourself. Get 10 of your friends. Measure the engagement, right? It's included in the price of the book. And one of our best kept secrets out there. So go out today, get those. Like I said, order a case of them and give them away as gifts to all your managers, right? So if you go to Q12.gallup.com, you see the login page that is here. And I've preloaded these just for simplicity. So they would go a lot faster in the dashboard as we're looking at them. But basically on the site, when we think about, there are a ton of resources available for you. And you can surf a lot of these without me having to go through it. There's a library of videos that you can go into that has Dr. Jim Harder explaining each of these Q12 elements. Listen to that for the short form, but you can also go back to the videos that Mike and I have made that we've covered every single one of these questions for you and how to use it, right? Today, we're going to just show you how it displays from that. You begin when you log in with your dashboard. And today I actually have 2 Q12 administrations in the field, so to speak. And this is what it would look like if you purchased the book. I have a team of 10 at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in the Rakes studio, in the Rakes Design Studio projects, that are in a current administration of it. So I have 10 seats and 3, as it looks here on the dashboard, 3 of those, or 30%, have taken advantage of the assessment so far. Every morning I get an email that says, hey, here's your current. I think we ship those out at like 2 in the morning or something like that, at least Central Time. And it'll tell me how many have taken it and where I'm at and where this thing is going to end. So I get a daily reminder from the system that's like, hey, so many people have taken it. You've got this much time left. You can see down here, down below, this survey is live. If it wasn't live, and I kind of wish I'd left one so I could actually set it up for you. It's really boring to walk through the setup process. It asks you questions like, when do you want it to start? When do you want it to end? How do you want to refer to these teams? What kind of wording are they? Are they a school, an organization, a workplace? Some of those kinds of questions it asks you. You also, in the setup process, you can ask up to 3 open-ended questions too. And we have, I think, 9 or 10 questions that you can select from that are open-ended. How have we made any progress since we took the Q12 the last time? Things like, what's one thing that would improve the place where I work, right? Mike, any on those? Are you familiar with those open-ended verbatim questions?
Yeah, I am. And I think, Jim, there's just an intelligence around which ones you're selecting, because the same accountability we would have to the 12 items is you really have to have that same accountability to your open-ended questions. So I would just, if I was to coach into it, just if you, as you are selecting those out, or you're working with your clients to select out which ones, don't feel like you have to select all of them. Sometimes that information has to be treated with a lot of respect, right? And so when you ask those questions, you need to know in advance, what are you going to do with the answers, and how are you going to use the answers? So I think you have to be prepared, right? And I think there has to be an intentionality around that. Otherwise, that credibility factor is lost in the delivery. The last thing you want to do is ask a question, right, that's not going to have any follow through or resolution to some degree to the audience that was asked of. So I think I think you just have to be mindful there. So I think too, the other thing is just don't yield to the temptation to, again, when I say ask them all, like the volume of content you can get back with one or two of the right ones is profound. And so when we think about a well-adjusted and well-equipped feedback session, sometimes we try to preempt that by asking verbatim questions up front. You have a nice blend around the measurement and the administration when you have a couple of verbatim questions up front, but then you want to position a lot of that open-ended qualitative for conversation to come up in the feedback session, where that team leader that's responsible for so much engagement, success to be central to what it feels like then as we sit around as a team and actually hear ourselves discuss this and own it out loud. So we just want to make sure we don't try to overlap too much or approximate what that feedback session should look like with our verbatim selection up front.
Yeah. Right on. Good advice. Just a couple reminders. We're on the current dashboard. We're going to look at reports. There's a resources tab. In fact, we help you. We've got a standardized email that you can send out to people that we're going to take this. We've done all the wording for you. You can change that wording if you want. Some suggestions on how and when and what, and some pointers on how to have a successful engagement in what you're doing. So that resources tab, Mike, we won't spend a ton of time going through it today, but so it's very, very helpful in getting your setup for the very first time. There's nothing like, by the way, I set these up when I started doing it. I'd had no formal training on the site. I just went out and just did it. Pretty easy to figure out. When you're setting up an engagement, of course, I talked about the survey dates. I can edit the details on the inside. When I'm ready, I can close the survey. If I want to add more respondents and I have seats available, I can do that as well. And then click to link the live survey here. I just click on that. It's going to actually generate a URL for me. And this is what I would send to my individuals so they could go in and take the survey. It's the same one I sent to them earlier. You can see we have a larger one right now. We're in the middle of administration where we're interviewing or we're surveying the freshman class for the Rake School, 39 of them. I will go in on Tuesday for their first feedback session. So they're in administration right now. They'll be answering questions through Sunday. We'll close those reports Sunday night. Those reports run overnight, and they'll be available for me generally Monday morning. I'll pull those and take a look at it, and then we'll take them onto campus on Tuesday and make those available to them. I'll print them out. I'm a big fan of, in this case, using printed reports. For them, it just gets that visualization in front of them, and I kind of know they're looking at it as opposed to looking at their screen when if we have them looking on their computer. So that's kind of the setup. When we think about setup and what that looks like, that is our dashboard screen. If we move on to the reports, you can see here, these are the administrations that I've made. So pretty easy. If I want to see some details and just click on the screen, I can log right in and kind of see based on the questions and the administration that we did. This was the one we did back in the spring of 2016. I can name these anything I want. It'll give me grand mean and the participation rate. Pretty good at 50 out of 51.
Yeah.
It's pretty good on that one. It's hard to get college students to do this kind of stuff, especially when their grades don't depend on it. By the way, we did this all, Mike, gradeless. In other words, it wasn't a part of their grade. We kind of wanted to not make it that, we wanted it to be more authentic in what they were doing. So we chose oftentimes not to grade this. That same year, here's an example I went to in the very beginning of the spring. This would have been early February or so. We measured their engagement at the beginning of the year, and then I went back at the middle of May, and we measured it at the end of the year, a 374. In the beginning, a 403. At the end, one of the things we found, Mike, which was really, really interesting, is we did this several times. There was always a 0.25 move between beginning of the year and end of the year, no matter what class we measured of this teacher, right? Which kind of spoke a little bit to his consistency. Each semester he taught, he would make little tweaks, change some things. We'll find out here in a second as we look at some of the reports. He wasn't very good at giving expectations, and so he changed that a little bit. You could see that expectation score kind of creep up a little bit in that. But you can see here, I've got the ability to quickly kind of go in and take a peek and see if I want to look at the overall scores here. I can get some idea of what they are. In this case, if we think about overall satisfaction, 474 out of 50 respondents, with the respondent score, and then this red means it's rank in relation to the Gallup database. Mike, can you talk just a smidge about the Gallup database and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Jim's doing with this class is essentially he's taking the relativity of this score of 374 up against our entire Gallup database. So if you think about every organization, regardless of industry, regardless of size or numbers of Q12 administrations, 374, this is where it stacks or ranks in comparison of a percentile, right? Relative to everybody for all their administrations, regardless of industry, geography, you name it. And so what it does is, quite frankly, it gives you I guess a context of understanding for your coaching to have an edge to it, to prioritize where do you give weight in terms of attention and time and feedback. So what it's essentially saying is that a 4.0 as a number isn't equal when it's relative to the entire database around what does best friend at work look like versus what do materials and equipment look like. 4 relative to the database for question number 10, best friend at work, could be really strong, where a 4 for knows what's expected might not necessarily be that strong of a score. And so when we talk about pulling a profile or pulling a headline or some narrative out of those numbers, the mean percentile rank gets very, very useful in terms of what exactly we're looking at, and more importantly, what should we do with it on the other side.
Mm-hmm. In these class settings, we're looking at the University of Maryland. The instructor was not always, or especially early, was not always very clear on his expectations. He left that open for interpretation. This was a senior level class. He wanted them to kind of come and figure some things out. He felt they were smart enough by this time to really be able to get there. And so he intentionally left details out of things, right or wrong. And they always scored very low on, which is interesting. No, it's expected of me as we're looking this as a 406. Now you go, 406 is pretty good. Not according to our global database.
Right.
So what does that mean? Well, we don't know until we start asking questions in the classroom, but it does start the process of, do we need to pay attention here, right? Some of these things we won't know until we ask questions on them. But, and again, to your point, best friend at work down there, is it a 359? 359, right? And it's in the 65th percentile.
Right.
And so not necessarily a struggle. What's really interesting is more materials and equipment. In all the college settings that I've done, that score has been particularly high compared to the enterprise. Yeah. So what's interesting is we find oftentimes in the college setting, they don't know what's expected of them as much, but they have a better grasp on their materials and equipment. And that's actually flipped in the enterprise. Yeah. Oftentimes we see a lot of employees know what's expected of them, but they may be short the tools they actually need to be able to do their job. And so the universities score really, really well in this setting, at least on this one. And I can say across many of the reports, it's very, very similar. We'll look at 2 in general here, or in specific, in just a second. I do want to roll down. If I wanted to export the overall report or all of them together, I could pull that here. If I had different types of groups selected, I only used one grouping on this, so it just allowed me to have that, but I could do that as well. Okay, so let's zip over to a report, because these are just more interesting as we take a peek here what's available here. So this is the actual PDF, the printable document that I would get. This happens to be last year's freshman year. Maybe I could blow this out. Well, we'll just leave it as it is there. Hold on, let's go full screen. Okay, so you can see on this report that we are looking, again, overall satisfaction for this group according to our database, very, very high, and at a 457, pretty good for a bunch of college students. Now, we have to remember, this is their first week, maybe second, of their freshman year in an honors program. These students have all been selected to be the best of the best for this program, and they really haven't had a struggle yet, right? They've been living in the dorms for a week or two. They still like their roommate. They're right. They haven't been tested, right? And so it doesn't surprise me in this scenario that we get some pretty good overall scores. But again, that Q1, there it is again. This is 2 years or a year later in a completely different school. And we're seeing this, no, it's expected of me, 3.90. Makes sense in some, it's our first week of school, right? I mean, you have had your syllabus. You really don't know what's ahead, right, Mike?
Yeah, no, I'm already thinking, and I'm sure the audience is as well. What are the questions that we could preliminarily ask that particular audience? Now knowing what you know with the next class to help give them that head start. Like I'm sure, just like the rest of you, I can't wait, Jim, to hear what happens spring semester as you head into 2019, and how do you and that course instructor get a head start on this? And regardless of whether you move it from the second percentile to the 98th, how much ground can you gain, and what kind of insight get back from that? So I can't wait to hear the other side of that feedback.
Mike, Lisa's asking, is there any way to split out, get university data only or get enterprise data only? Or this is in this tool, again, this is our basic tool. It's comparing it to the entire database. So you don't want to drill too hard or make too many assumptions, because you've got a lot of different stuff going on here, right? It's just a reference, right? It is just a reference. In this case, like, wow, 390, compared to the global database. Well, that's low to begin with, but it begins to, when I go in, when I'm able to go in, we would give these, like I said, second week, and then I would go back in at week 4. We talk about how they're doing on their teams. And I would ask the question, do you know it's expected of you on this team? Can you give a 5 to that right now? And if no, why not? Oh, Mike, we got tons of great feedback, right?
Yeah.
As they started thinking about, okay, I'm on this team. And they had to say it with each other. So they could have started understanding, what am I missing?
Yeah.
You're scheduling meetings when I can't be there. Like, I don't actually know, one person is taking control of the project, and I don't actually know what I'm supposed to do. Right. But it allows you to quickly drill into those questions. And like I said before, materials and equipment, pretty high at a 4.33. And again, a lot of these college students, they have everything. They feel like, at least at that time, they have everything they need. Mike, think about this though. You're a manager, or you're going to go in and do some consulting. This is your team.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through a little bit. What's your process of reading through this? And in 2 minutes, what kind of insights do you start to, and more than, you're not telling the teams how they feel. You're using this to ask questions on how they feel or how things are. So as you're reading this, what do you see? Or can you? I guess I should ask, can you read this?
Yeah, I think I can. Yeah. So Jim, this is such a great example, and again, I'm sure, like the rest of the audience, it's hard not to get pulled into almost personally what it's like to be inside this team. And so I love the scorecard that we have up in front and what we can do with it. I did want to react to Lisa's question though about the ability to split out the context of those percentile rankings. Well, there is an intelligence in terms of the comparison. The profile of high and low and medium doesn't change those still. The number changes, but the green area is still green, the yellow is still yellow. They might adjust somewhat in terms of the percentile rankings that they represent, but for this group, regardless of what context or what comparable we put them up against, they're going to be strong in question number 2, right? They're going to be compromised in question number 1. So the conversations don't really change, and a lot of the decisions and actions don't necessarily change when we switch out those comparisons. So hopefully there's a trust in that, what we actually do with it.
You shouldn't get bogged down. It will bog down some teams, because they'll immediately go to the colors. Mm-hmm. And it's a great coaching opportunity to kind of say, hey guys, this is just a comparison, and let's get to the real heart of the matter. And so as we think about getting to the heart of the matter, Mike, in a 2-minute synopsis, what do you see here?
Yeah. So if we were to really translate what's on in front of us, first off, we like to look at kind of the themes, so to speak. And again, this is where this audience is so well equipped for this, because you would never just look at a strength by itself, right? You would never just look at somebody who has achiever without looking at the rest of their 4 strengths in their top 5. It's the same kind of approach you want to take with your engagement scorecard. So when we look at this, start to look at 1 or 2 or 3 types of combinations of strengths. So isn't it interesting that question 1, compromised, question 2, quite profound, and then question 3, probably a little bit, well, not probably, but is lower than what we would ideally like to see in what's represented there, 37th percentile and a 3.9. So what could happen if we consider questions 1, 2, and 3, and we've had these conversations, right? That there's kind of a hierarchical order to the Q12. Foundationally, we've got something that we need to restore or reinforce before we get too wildly animated or excited about what else needs to happen here on this scorecard. So first and foremost, obviously, we have to have conversations that really attack and produce solutions around what's going on around question 1. And right, as good coaches and consultants, we'd simply ask a lot of questions about what does a 5 look like for our team? How do we then back that out or reverse engineer it in a way that we can deliver on a 5? What are the barriers? Right? Where are we at our best around this item? But how are we collectively going to move it forward and be part of the solution ourselves, not just saying, hey, it's Jim's problem or it's the professor's problem to solve for us. But when we think about that in that initial view, think then about how do we leverage the strength of materials and equipment to where it becomes the tent pole that we can lift expectations, that we can lift opportunity to do best up and have a bundled approach where kind of that, when you think about what is it, a single strand by itself, not so strong, but a 3-strand cord produces a really strong rope. And how can you start to intertwine a couple of strong items and low items together where they can be leveraged really effectively? And it's a momentum factor. It's a strengths-based approach, actually, right? You always start off with where are we strong and where's our position for success, and how do we then lift up these other areas to where they might also achieve success as well. So that's the first thing I look at is start off with questions 1, 2, and 3. You'll have a lot of clients that want to race to the top. But in the first Break All the Rules book, it has a great metaphor of altitude sickness, right? You would never have a helicopter drop you off at the top of Everest and expect to live there very long because you haven't developed the ability to process oxygen at that altitude. You have to establish base camps and reinforce your body's ability to process and then move on up. And it's the same approach we would take with this scorecard. Some of the other things.
I don't know about you, Mike. I just go right to the top.
Do you just go right to the top?
I just drop me off on the helicopter. I'm good. And then I get back in. I've been to the top of Everest. No, just kidding.
You can definitely do that. The other thing I like to have them to think about as well on the scorecard is to even look at participation. Sometimes people glance past participation too quickly. We don't see it as much on this scorecard, Jim, but on a lot of them, you'll find that there's going to be items that some people just don't even rate those at all. Okay. And there's a story inside that we shouldn't skip. Why would somebody not even rate that item? We see it a lot on best friend. We see it sometimes on recognition where people essentially they're disqualify themselves because they're like, this is so out of touch or so a non-existence for me that I don't even have anything within my grasp to start to create a rating from. And so I think that's an important piece. What is it that we can even start to move around people's notion of participation? Participation by itself is engagement, right? And there's a lot of clients, I work with them, and you all will end up working with them if you're not already, where their primary issue is just developing a culture of trust for them to even arrive at a level of participation where they can even start to trust the scores on the other side, right? And so you've got it. So I think there's a statement there that we want to make sure, and you can see that in the scorecard. Yeah. And I think too, Jim, and again, in the 2 minutes you've given me, the last thing that I would kind of cause our eyes to orient towards is you see that percentage of engaged, right? And Jim, if I see this right, is it 40% exactly?
Yes, correct.
40% exactly. And so, Jim, you had approximately 39 people at the most who could participate in this particular.
And this is I think it was 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at 40%, I'm not perfect on my math, but you've got about 13 people. If we think about translating percent engaged to bodies, to individuals, you got about 13 people, right, that are going to categorically fit inside that mindset of engagement, right, where they're involved, they're committed, and they're enthusiastic. So I think sometimes in our translation of these scorecards, while the percentages are useful, help a client think about that's the number of people you have inside your team or your organization who are categorically engaged. And if we do this right, think about how we reach a tipping point. Well, what if we had 50%? What if we had 15 to 16 people now, and more than every other person that I run into in the hallway or the lunchroom or the classroom is engaged? I don't have the geography in between engaged people to get actively disengaged myself, to not be engaged myself. And so I think it helps give a literal presence, right? Which is one of the outcomes, Jim, that we're trying to always arrive at with our coaching and our use of the numbers, is how do we create this physical presence of engagement? I think we can distill or draw out of that translation of percentage to people, a physical presence of engagement that helps clients understand what they're actually creating and building. In that perspective. So those are my knee-jerk reactions, I guess, Jim, to what you're seeing on this particular scorecard. If I was just in a 2-minute.
No, right on.
Space.
As a team lead, I'm digging in on 1 and 3. If I was responsible to manage these individuals, especially in a work environment, again, depending on how long they've been together and what I know about them, but I'm going to really want to spend some time on making sure, like, where are we missing from an expectation standpoint, and doing some things to get that part figured out. To your point too, lots of folks start bringing in strengths at Q3, the opportunity to do best. And this group may feel like they're not perfectly aligned. Again, makes sense the second day of class, right? Or the second week of class when we're doing this, but at least opens the doors for some questions along these lines. I teach them after we talk about this, I give them 3 techniques to improve their engagement, and they're pretty standard. One is, let's always work on number 1 and make sure every day we're checking in. I know what my place is on this team, right? Mm-hmm. So in your daily stand-up, make sure if you have any questions, or weekly stand-up, make sure you know what am I doing, and what am I supposed to be doing, and what am I going to be doing, right? Those are really, really important in what's expected. 2, that we get recognition going in this environment, right? How do we recognize each other for a job well done? We know that is like gasoline on a fire, right? And it will light teams up if they really start recognizing one another. And then we go to Q10, best friend. You guys have to work on your friendships while you're in these teams, right? You have to spend some time. 3 simple things that they can do to kind of jumpstart the engagement in their teams is kind of how we teach that. Down below, of course, is the rest of the reports by teams. And so you can kind of see here, we won't spend a lot of time. Those are the teams broken down. If we don't have 4 more in a team, it doesn't appear. And so if the teams are too small, right, you don't want them to be able to get access to that data, because it can start pinpointing it to a person. Mike, I want to dive into the next report then. We went back at the end of the year and said, hey, by the way, super easy. I went in, got the seats, said, is there a administration you want to associate this with? I said, yes. Pulls everything over from the prior administration, including the team names and the groups and such, and allows me to do this. So at the end of the year, we moved from a 4-4 to a 4-1-2, and we see some changes. Mike, I'll ask you the same thing. As you're the manager of this team. You just got some results back. You're looking at the scorecard for the first time. What kind of things do you see?
Yeah. So first, right off, we want to look at that comparison of the grand mean, right, past and current. So it's a nice increase. 0.08 is, any increase is an increase, so you always claim that. What we're really looking for is a 0.2 increase. We consider that to be meaningful in its direction. So this is within 0.2. So again, not that we won't take any increase, but I think to really drive edge and action around what we want to claim and substantiate, we would want to hit that a 0.2. But it's trending up, right? And there's a lot of opportunity within that momentum to keep adding more. It's interesting to me, Jim. I think as much as what went up is some of the things that went down, right? And I think we look at and you see for our visual, right, the up arrows or down arrows indicated by change. Interesting that expectations, you would think for the investment, right, inexplicably, at least to our point right now, went down. When in theory, I would assume, Jim, that there was some investment or some active conversation around it. So that provokes different conversations now, right? Were there a different set of circumstances and currents that changed our ability to interpret expectations along the way? So just when we think we've solved one problem, 3 more, or one challenge, 3 more areas of context emerge that we hadn't accounted for. So you see the drive for a futuristic lean in engagement, just like we have a futuristic lean in the possession of our strengths. So one of the call to action around this perspective that we see a lot is a 5 today won't look like a 5 6 months from now. It won't look like what a 5 is a year from now. And so our appetite for pace and that accelerated attitude towards driving engagement change is going to have to be very, very quick if we're going to have the right answers futuristically. But the one thing is, but look at this though. We see some nice greens emerge, and we see some yellows start to show up where we didn't before. I still think, Jim, you have to go back to that foundational approach. This would be a team if I would say, hey, great that we're seeing some accentuation across here in terms of the green and even some convergence of the yellows. But we would be giving bad advice if we told them to still not pay attention to that first item predominantly. The first three really is a bundle. I will say, Jim, I loved your advice earlier, those 3 pressure points. I still think you have to keep coming back around. And we see this if we really start to leverage and integrate some of our resources and reports. We all heard this in our examination of question number 4. Jim spoke to it directly. But you can almost every time, as a go-to move, come against recognition. Recognition might be, again, the most underutilized and easiest strategy to implement in any workplace to activate and really work through all of engagement. Once you start bringing out those mutually contributed and shared perspectives of recognition for each of us, not just as professor to class or team leader to team, but that created that mutual accountability around peer-to-peer recognition, then you're really starting to drive and move things forward. And that activates so much of the rest, remaining opportunities that we can possibly move forward from there. But think about that though. We have that context, all of us have that context from our State of the American Workplace report. We have that context from 12, the elements of great managing, that underscores how underutilized recognition actually is. And Jim, when we go back to that theme of expectations, that it just is a recurring pattern. We know that in the workplace, because we've read the State of the American Workplace report, 50% of the workplace wakes up and they can't say yes to that question. So is it really that shocking that in a dynamic environment like a classroom, with students who haven't really equipped and found that solid foundation and footing to make sense out of their world, are attacked, I guess, or are compromised around that one particular item. So it puts a lot of things up in our lens that we can pay attention to that we wouldn't have at our disposal otherwise.
Rick asked a question in the chat room. I think it's a good one, and I'm going to add a little bit to it. But he says, is there a time to move beyond a question or camp before it hits a solid 5 in an assessment? And I'm going to ask a sub question of, is our goal 5s here? Like, are we trying to get all 5s? So that, hold that question. And if we, at a later date, Q2 regresses, do we immediately abandon efforts on Q4 and return to focusing on Q2? It's kind of a hierarchy question. Mm-hmm. Is our goal to squeeze it like a toothpaste container from the bottom up? And, I have to start at the bottom and work my way up, and I can't work any farther down until I've gotten a Q, like in this case, like Q1 was, 3, 6, 3. Is that all I can do, is work on Q1 until I get that to a 4.5 or 5 before I move on? Can you kind of address that?
Yeah. So one of the things I think that we probably haven't, I think, positioned the scorecard strongly enough, Jim, in our conversation, is putting, and you mentioned this. I loved what you said about how you run off copies for each person who's going to be involved in that feedback discussion. And I think there's not to sound cliche, but there is an ownership mentality when I get a piece of paper that has a color-coded schematic of our scores that I contributed to. And there's a statement that's made there. Now, I want to unpack that a little bit, because the statement that's made is ownership and buy-in. And I think sometimes, to Rick's question, guess what the beauty of this is? Just as coaches would with strengths, we would have the same approach with engagement. We don't have to know the answers. We actually get to position the conversation and ask the right questions, where the team, in this notion of buy-in, they get to create the meaningful connections. Now, we can, in a broad way, kind of guide that conversation and say, hey, we might want to take this foundational aspect of it. But similar to the scorecard you just showed, Jim, there were really strong, consistent themes in items 7 through 12 that we don't have to ignore. We can connect those back down but it's the team's facilitated conversation and buy-in where they intentionally say, hey, if we're strong and best friend, how can we use that to leverage expectations? Who are the people in our relationship and our connections with each other where we can make sure that people aren't left behind? If one or two of us know something and we have a concrete level of understanding around it, if you know something, for crying out loud, share it with Jim and shore up his expectation level. And the same thing with Jim. And let's mutually reinforce that. And how can we unpack that as an advantage to lift that item up? So it's not prescriptive, it's guided as a way to say that. But I think that the thing that draws out of that as much as a premise that anything we want to essentially fixate on is that I would contend that in leading engagement, buy-in rivals strategy, if not exceeds strategy. That, we can have a perfect seamless plan put together, but if we haven't been able to join our opinions and voices and efforts collectively to deliver on it, it's just a nice exercise that exists on a piece of paper. But we've all seen this. We've been part of teams where we blew through the right strategy. We just, the force of that nature yielded to our own intentionality and drove it towards success. So we want both, but we sometimes, I think, in our temptation to analyze, miss the joint conversation that really produces that engagement result. So,
Mike, in some of the work that we've done, we have seen where, especially as it's broken down by teams, where an assessment gets pencil whipped.
mm-hmm.
In other words, the students are going in, and employees can do this as well. 5, 5, 5. I don't want to talk about this. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Right? They just crush it, and you get these reports back that are green. It's green across the board. Yeah. It's these ridiculous numbers, and on the surface, you would go, yikes. Like, these guys are really engaged. This is going to be super easy, when it couldn't be any more from the truth. Yeah. Like, they actually may, and what we have found from test scores is those teams we had suspicion of, we would go in, I'd go in with the instructors, and he talked about some of the work that they were currently doing. And he measured this engagement up to their output. So this was like you would get at work, right? He would measure it to their output. And he had a few trial exercises that he'd have them go through in those first couple weeks. Then we'd measure, and he'd say, they're totally faking it. Like, there is no way, right? Which, as a manager, is a great clue to, even though the report says this, right, I've got problems.
Right.
And I cannot ignore those problems. And so you can't get these reports. This is to the second question, is the goal 5s. The goal isn't a number. The goal is a conversation, and those numbers are going to mean different things based on the teams that you're working with. And some teams who are brutally honest will actually be in the 3s, and they may actually have better engagement than teams that are 4.5 because they're just like, yeah, whatever, right? And so we have to be very, very cautious of not making assumptions based on the first time I read it, especially blind, right? How does it match up to the performance data? What did the prior manager say about the team? Or what's been my experience with the team over the last 3 to 5 years? Do they match this? Were they being honest with me, right? Or with the assessment? So I think there's some nuances in that piece as well to kind of think through, like, okay, the numbers mean something. So say we're all 3s, but I want to go down to mission and purpose because I feel like that may help some other things. Could you do that, Mike? Talk a little bit about would I make that jump?
Absolutely. Again, that's where, it's just like with coaching, it's the conversation, right? So it's not Strengths Finder, it's the coaching that activates Strengths Finder. It's not measuring the engagement, it's the conversation that releases the power of the engagement. So the parallels are just really on point. But Jim, I think you bring up a great context around this. So what if you did have all 5s? I loved and knew you'd have the right response to that, which is like, okay, where's the evidence then? Because we don't talk about engagement without performance. We don't talk about performance without engagement. So I think there's a call out that I think was really good, where the professor says, okay, guys, you claimed that you're engaged. Could you be found guilty in your performance that would be associated with it? And so I think in the moment, that's a great way to call that out. But if legitimately, and Jim, you've had teams, I've had teams, you'll run across teams where they are legitimately, they really are a 5. And so that's not bad. But what it is a convergence. Now, what are we going to do with it? So if you do have teams that legitimately are all 5, what's the aspirational claim they're going to make now around performance. So if I just worked with Jim, I was just with a client yesterday, great scores coming out of it. They're having this conversation. Our coaching and consulting and advice for them was, what's the biggest thing you have in front of you that you can now claim because you've got this engagement engine that's revved up and ready to go? You should elevate your goals. You should go for something big because your group is ready for it. And so the tension between performance and engagement is leveraged really well. And it doesn't become a standalone exercise and point in time. So the orientation we always want to have around that is that, again, I talked about it, but what we just measured and we activated around what a 5 is today. But let's drive toward what's a 5 going to look like in 6 months. We can have the conversation now and describe the future and predict the future because we're going to actually create it as we fill in that space and time and that pursuit around what a 5 is. So Jim, I think the whole theme about this is, and I'm going to tell all of you for sure, you're going to have clients who are going to hold themselves hostage by the numbers in the way that Jim and I are encouraging you not to allow that to happen. And so you need to push past those metrics on into now, what are you going to do? Almost rush past that into the accountability and the call to action with it. So, again, we started, Jim, I think the whole series, we started off with maybe the very first point of reference. It's not about moving your engagement numbers. It's about what your engagement numbers are going to move that really matters. Jim, one more last coaching point that I'll kind of throw in the midst of this kind of tone at this point here is a 5 always good, right? Do we always have to have a 5? I will contend, and this is where you'll see the value of that push past being held hostage, is you don't necessarily want 5s, but what you do want is for everybody who's involved and for every item that they're going to rate, for that item, for them to rate that item as accurately as they possibly can, as authentically as they possibly can, relative to what it represents in terms of their workplace needs, the performance context that they're operating in, and that's your best number. And I contend if you lead through that perspective, you might get 5s. But if you get 5s, it's because you did the right thing in response to it. It's not because you did the right things necessarily leading into the mindset of what that number should represent. So there's an authenticity to it that I don't think we should miss. But I love it when workplaces and teams really challenge themselves. What does a 5 look like? And are we really living up to it? And if we're not, our best number, regardless, is where are we accurately at right now, because that's going to give you the biggest gain for that next time around. And then that's where you start to see participation creep up, because there's a confidence level that, hey, when we say and participate things around this measurement of these 12 items, something actually happens and we're part of it and it's positive and productive. So a lot of context there.
No, a lot of good information. Rick has given us some good encouragement in the chat room, and we'll appreciate with everybody sticking with us through 14. Just like listening to Theme Thursday, it does not make you a coach. Listening to Q12 for coaches maybe does not make you an engagement champion. And so, Mike, as we think about, we have some deep learning around this. Can you talk a little bit about if individuals wanted to get more, we've got some courses around this that you can really start sinking your teeth into. Once they've tried this, what could they take from us?
Yeah, if you enjoyed these discussions, and I think Jim and I have been caught up in them quite a bit, but the right place for you to be, honestly, is in our Engagement Champions course. Everything that we've tried to unpack in these 14 discussions is really brought even more so out in our 2-day course, where you immerse yourself in the research and the understanding of how the 12 elements even were discovered, right? To a degree that Jim and I haven't got to yet. You'll get context around what each of them represents in terms of a motivational or psychological need. And you start to then think about, how do you coach team leaders and teams through that lens and perspective of engagement? How does that roll up and validate itself around performance outcomes? You also get into just some amazing resources that really help you pull headlines out of the data, right? And in a large part of our role, just as we would with an individual, how do they tell a story through their strengths that leads to performance? With engagement, it's how do we help teams and organizations tell a story of their success through what those engagement scores mean to us. And so it is that qualitative feel that really helps them drive and push to action. All of that is brought to bear really in our Engagement Champions course. So again, if this series of 14 has resonated with you, make sure that you find yourself in the middle of that course at some point in time sooner than later. Another course we have that really helps us get into the mind of the leader, the mind of the team leader, to see the world from their perspective. Or if you lead teams yourself, also in your role as a coach, really think about our Leading High Performing Teams coach. That's all about who am I as a leader through knowing my own strengths? How do I lead a team by knowing their collective strengths? How do we convert that strengths-based approach on into a culture of engagement? And now knowing what we know about engagement, how do we combine those two then to drive on into performance? And it concludes with an understanding and application of our 5 conversations that really roll up and were discovered through our re-engineering performance management paper. And so now you're taking all of strengths, all of engagement, and pushing it through into 5 conversations that really translate on into the most meaningful, relevant performance outcomes that your team or individuals might require most. And then we obviously, if the timing doesn't work out for you to attend those courses, there's resources available where you can consume those and approximate as much as you can, as much of that experience as you can within your own efforts. Our engagement starter pack has that first break all the rules book with the 2 codes. It's got a creating an engaged workplace for manager packet. So there's resources inside that help you start to think about coaching a manager, coaching a team leader to activate all of what Jim and I have talked about in this 14-part series. And then there's just great discussion cards. So your ability to equip team leaders with really well-constructed, thought-out questions where they don't have to, team leaders don't necessarily like to do those kinds of things. They weren't hired to be into instructional design. And if you arm them with the right questions, they can move into performance through strengths and engagement really, really fast. And so just great ways for you to bring all of this to into a point and a perspective of performance through your own immersion and the resources that are involved through these courses and resources.
All right. With that, we'll kind of put a wrap on it. You and I have some ideas of some things maybe coming over the winter. So we'll be, you want to stay tuned in to our Eventbrite page, gallup.eventbrite.com. We'll get you there as we, I think we're going to try and spend some time unpacking the State of the American Workplace report for coaches. So what does that mean? And maybe the Millennials report as well. So those will be kind of one-offs off the series, but a chance for you to engage with us. Remember, you can actually follow us over there at Eventbrite now. There's a little follow button, and every time we add something to that list, it's like an RSS feed. It gives you a notification via email, so you never miss a program. I'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available at the Business Center and Strength Center, GallupStrengthCenter.com or Q12.Gallup.com. Get you there. Send us your questions or comments to coaching@Gallup.com. If these has sparked any interest in that, you can send it. And if you're just want to talk to somebody about some of that training, send it to that coaching@Gallup.com and mention that in there, and we'll have one of our salespeople call you right back. You can catch the recorded version. Maybe this is the first one you caught and you're like, oh, I missed the other ones. It's okay. We recorded them all for you. They're available in actually a YouTube series as well as our Called to Coach podcast channel. So subscribe to those. If you can't find it, send me an email, coaching@Gallup.com. We'll get you directed there as well. Don't forget that if you want to take one of those courses, we have a whole bunch now that are available for you. And if you just want to peruse through the list, some of you just like looking at lists like that, head over to courses.gallup.com and all that information is there. I want to thank you for joining us for this series. Mike and I will be back, like I said, later in the winter with some additional stuff. We don't know yet. We haven't quite figured out what we're going to do. I'm excited about it, Mike. Yeah. We'll be back with more as we think about next year. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.